plates. At least you have food, so that's great. My name is Lauren Myers, and I'm the Director of Programming for the Black Law Students Association. Today's panel is entitled, I'll Say What I Want, Hate Crime Policy and the First Amendment. It's our final event in our series of Black History Month events this month, so thanks for joining us. In the past year, our nation has seen a number of instances of what could be considered hate crimes on college campuses. Many of you know about the incidents on University of Missouri's campus that eventually led to the school's football team staging a boycott, calling for the president to resign. Players and students alike were enraged at his lack of response to incidents of racial hatred on campus, including students writing a swastika and feces on a bathroom wall in a dormitory. Even here at Duke, we've seen various incidents of racial and other sorts of hatred on campus. There was a noose hung on campus in the spring of last year. There have been derogatory terms written on dorm entrances and on posters for events. So a lot of these incidents are causing people to ask questions about what colleges and universities can do to address these issues. And today's panel will talk a little bit about how the First Amendment plays a role in that and in hate crime policies on college campuses and beyond. So I want to introduce our panelists. Guy-Uriel Charles is the founding director of the Duke Law Center on Law, Race, and Politics. He's an expert in and frequent public commentator on constitutional law, election law, campaign finance, redistricting, politics.
Stop there.
Okay.
Thank you.
That's enough? Okay.
Way past enough.
Okay. Next.
Talk more about these guys.
And Professor Charles will be moderating the discussion. Next to him is Professor Stuart M. Benjamin. He's the Douglas B. Maggs Professor of Law, Associate Dean for Research and Co-Director of the Center for Innovation Policy at Duke Law School. He specializes in telecommunications law, the First Amendment, and administrative law. And from 2009 to 2011, he was the first distinguished scholar at the Federal Communications Commission. Next to him is Michael J. Schoenfeld, who is the Vice President for Public Affairs and Government Relations for Duke University. In this role, he oversees communications and advocacy for the university and the medical center, the university's Washington, D.C. center, and serves as Duke's chief spokesperson. He's also an adjunct lecturer in the Sanford School of Public Policy, where he teaches a course on media and politics. And then finally, we have Professor Neil S. Siegel, who is the David W. Eichel Professor of Law and Professor of Political Science at Duke Law School, where he also serves as the co-director of the program in public law and director of the D.C. Summer Institute on Law and Policy. Professor Siegel's research and teaching fall in the areas of U.S. constitutional law, constitutional theory, and federal courts. So thank you all for joining us. Let's get started.
Thank you. Perfect. So first, thank you so much, Lauren and Balsa, for organizing a series of very interesting and provocative thoughts. So if you wouldn't mind just giving her a round of applause for all the work that you've been doing. It's a pleasure to be here and to engage in conversation with my distinguished colleague, Mike Schoenfeld. And there are these other people who share my hallway. But all three of my distinguished colleagues, two of whom know how much I sincerely love them and spend a lot of time with them. So it's a pleasure to be talking to them about these very difficult issues. And I hope that we can have a productive 40 minutes or so thinking very hard as we do as lawyers on these questions. All right, so the first question that I'll pose, so we're here to talk about and think about the relationship between the First Amendment and hate speech or hate crimes. So we'll take hate crimes and hate speech as they are two different categories and just try to get a sense of, when we talk about hate speech and when we talk about hate crimes, what in the world are we talking about? What do we think of? Where are we in the definitional world? What's hate speech and what is a hate crime?
Well, I can start with an example. I can't define hate speech for you. Hate crime, I think, is a little easier. Hate crime is an enhancement for the same criminal conduct based upon a certain kind of motivation or conscious object that's deemed invidious. Say, race motivated, gender motivated, violence motivated by homophobic beliefs. Hate speech is I think harder to define, and I can give you an example. University of Michigan adopted a hate speech code that prohibited any behavior, verbal or physical, that stigmatizes or victimizes an individual on the basis of race, ethnicity, religion, sex, sexual orientation, creed, national origin, ancestry, age, marital status, handicap, or Vietnam-era veteran status. We'll get into whether that's constitutional. The answer under longstanding doctrine is not a hard one.
Right. In fact, let me just pick up on that. I don't think we have a good definition of hate speech in this country because every attempt at regulating hate speech has been struck down. So Michigan one was struck down, Wisconsin's been struck down, and so universities and localities don't even really try anymore. And so we don't have a robust definition of hate speech that had been in any sense accepted in our jurisprudence. They've all been utterly rejected in our jurisprudence. Whereas hate crime statutes have been upheld. The idea is there actually is this physical act, and we're just looking at your mens rea in undertaking the physical act. Let me just say briefly on this point about hate speech. Might as well say it somewhere. This is as good a place as any to say it. We are outliers. In the United States, we are outliers in the world. So the rest of the world thinks we're crazy, and we think they're crazy. In many countries, it is illegal to deny the Holocaust. In Germany, it is illegal to advocate for Nazism. It's illegal to own Nazi paraphernalia. So when neo-Nazis want to buy their paraphernalia, they order it from the United States. The reason they order from the United States is that's protected speech here. So Germany says, wait a minute, so you fought a war and then imposed a constitution on us that prohibits us from advocating Nazism, so now our Nazis have to get their paraphernalia from you all in the United States because you say your First Amendment protects that which you prevented us from even having in our country, and we say, yeah, that's about it. So the rest of the world does have definitions of hate speech, of things that are that are in a category that are proscribable, and we don't in this country, outside some very narrow, First Amendment, very narrow doctrines of true threats. So, this might surprise you, some cross burnings are political speech. It has to be, the only cross burnings that are going to be a threat is if it's like really done, actually aimed at a person, like on their lawn or something like that. Narrow exception for incitement, but it's got to be that there is a likelihood of imminent violence. And other very, very narrow exceptions, nothing whatever that would cover hate speech. Anyway, I've gone too far beyond your question. But.
No, that's actually perfect. Mike, do you want to jump in there? Or do you want to think about the role of especially of a private elite university operating within a broad First Amendment free speech tradition? So either of those you can.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here today. I am not a lawyer, so I'm not going to pretend to. Well, actually, I have pretended before. I sometimes practice without a license, but that's subject for another story for another day. I have been dealing with. Like Stuart and Neil, I don't have an answer, certainly, for what is hate speech. I've been dealing with these issues for almost 20 years now on college campuses and in a variety of forms. And hate speech has been one of the most frequently used and most frequently misunderstood and mischaracterized statements that any university administrator has to deal with. It is, at least in the current vernacular, it has been, unfortunately, I think, defined to include pretty much anything that offends the sensibilities of any individual or group. That's a very gross definition of it, but that is the way that it has been used in practice when you have situations that come up on campus. The legal definitions obviously are much more nuanced and much more and much stickier. As far as a private university, I think you hit the nail on the head. As a private university, and I'll look to my legal colleagues for backup here, we are not state actors. So we don't have the ability to infringe on somebody's First Amendment rights.
Correct.
And that has both strong positives and values for the university, but it also creates tensions in time of dispute about actions and what people say. So the very easy response when somebody asks me, are you violating somebody's First Amendment rights? The answer is we can violate their rights, their First Amendment rights, with impunity, because we're not in a position to exercise any control over as an actor of the state.
Let me ask you another question before I go to my lovely colleagues, and they are lovely. So, Mike, where do you think we are now in the incidence of hate speech on campus? So, do you think we are at historic highs? Do you think we are where things have always been? Do you think it's historic lows? Sort of like there's a sense that the current era that we live in is worse than others, but that's probably because some things might be more or less salient to different ones of us, but you're seeing the full picture, and you also have a broader historical sense. So can you locate us on that time horizon and spectrum?
Great question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm good at this.
Usually I ask the question. I'm happy to answer. I think where we are, well, I don't think that there are large peaks and valleys in this. I think there is a very constant state. Where we are is not so much in the number of incidences, it's perhaps in the speed in which any particular issue, whether it's writing on a wall or a tweet or a Facebook post or some other action, can quickly capture the attention not just of the local community, but pretty much around the world. So the speed at which that happens, the ability to transmit pictures and videos and reaction in real time, I mean literally in real time, and the speed at which these things burn out. There are many examples of situations that burn very hot for a very brief period of time and then have gone away. So I don't think the number or necessarily the virulence of them is at a new peak or an all-time high. Certainly our knowledge of them and our ability to process what happened and how people respond to them is, however, at a peak that's going to keep on growing.
Can I just ask then my two colleagues about this, especially from the classroom perspective? How do you all manage and think about managing sensitive speech in the classroom? Because I think we're also affected by the internet and the speed at which these things can spread as well. So within a broad free speech tradition, right, so not subject to the First Amendment, but free speech tradition, as well as within an academic framework. So both of those, I think, are prevalent here. How do we think about managing, dealing with difficult topics and sensitive topics that may border on, if not certainly politically incorrect speech, but maybe even speech that one can argue about? And you both teach fairly sensitive subjects.
Sure. I mean, there's a lot, right? There's a lot in that. There's a lot in that question.
You're not going to praise my question?
No, I'm not.
Disappointed.
The first thing to point out is it's not, the classroom is not the public square, right? Students don't have an unlimited right to say what they want when they want it within the managerial domain of the classroom, just like someone who works for the government in his or her capacity as a government employee doesn't have the right to say whatever he or she wants throughout the workday, right? So that is a much more of a regulable environment, even if we were at a public school, because you're actually trying to run the class, and not everyone is similarly situated with respect to the authority they're given to do that. So there's all kinds of ways in which I think professors have to and do execute their responsibilities to run a productive class that doesn't involve people getting to say whatever they want when they want to. I don't think that's the thrust of your question, but I just do want to point out that there are different domains in which First Amendment values, right, are going to be vindicated to a greater or lesser extent. In terms of how I deal with the basic question, I mean, I tell my students on day one that whether I'm teaching people to become lawyers or teaching undergraduates to become members of a broader community, country, and world, I'm teaching people to understand their own strengths, to understand their own resourcefulness, to understand their own capacity to hear things they really don't want to hear, and not respond with the impulse to say, make them stop talking, but rather they'll have their own capacity to talk up in response. And so I tell people, whether it's race, whether it's abortion, whether it's free speech on campus, within a broad range of reasonableness, I'm going to invite people to express a wide variety of views. And I insist on that. Now, I say a broad range of reasonableness because there are some things I'm not going to accept, right? I'm not going to relitigate whether or not people of color are inherently inferior, right? Which was something that was obvious at the time of the founding. It's something Thomas Jefferson wrote about. I think there is a broad range of reasonableness. I don't think it's unlimited. But within that broad range, we're going to talk about the efficacy as well as the constitutionality of affirmative action in higher education. And by the way, if you take that Michigan speech code seriously, perhaps advocacy, defense of affirmative action stigmatizes people based on their race. That's one of the conservative arguments against affirmative action. This is the problem with just how broad and vague these hate speech codes are. What does it mean to victimize or stigmatize? People on both sides of the debate are saying that's what the other side is doing. And so I teach, right, I try to teach my students that, right, that they're not, that they have the strength and the resources, which I'm trying to impart, right, to help them to gather for themselves, to respond to speech that they find is deeply offensive, wrong, hurtful in various ways, and that you're much better prepared to participate in the broader society if you think about it from that point of view. How can I most effectively respond or ignore what I'm hearing? Then how can we arrange things so that the other side is no longer allowed to speak?
Stuart, can I just add one thing to that to have you jump in? So sometimes people might think that broad free speech protections, this is built on something that Neil just said, broad free speech protections are anti-equality. This is evidence for Neil's point that broad free speech protections could also be pro-equality. So in the NAACP line of cases, all right. So if you might talk about both sides of the relationship between free speech and how it relates to equality, whether it's racial, whether it's religious, whether it's sexual orientation, whether it's gender, in addition to some of the classroom things. I think they may be also related.
Sure. So let me just start with the classroom thing. So we're teaching law students. As a lawyer, sometimes you don't get to pick your clients, but no matter, even if you do pick your clients, you need to be able to understand the arguments on both sides. So law schools are particularly a place where we think a whole wide range of views needs to be aired. This is something that has come up with for me when I've had colleagues ask me, do you have a trigger warning in your First Amendment class? And what I realized was that the casebook that I use, like most First Amendment casebooks, starts with Brandenburg versus United States, really foundational case. So before the first class, you read Brandenburg. Now, Brandenburg was a case in which the guy, Brandenburg, advocated, one of my favorite terms, revengeance against blacks and Jews, except he didn't say blacks. So before you've laid eyes on me, you've read Brandenburg, and then maybe our fourth or fifth case in, we read the case involving the church that you all may know of that will go and picket funerals with signs that say, thank God for your dead son, thank God for IEDs, and that the United States is going to hell because it tolerates homosexuality. So the whole class would have to be a trigger warning. I don't know what class. I mean, in every single class, we're going to deal with things are going to come up that are hot button issues that people find very upsetting. So it may be that I need to, but I mean, I'd have to put it right in the syllabus before you ever actually laid eyes on me. Like, this is a First Amendment class. It's about free speech. Be really careful because we're going to be covering lots of really unpleasant speech.
That's why I do it on day one, right? You can call it just a trigger warning for the class, so I don't have to make issue by issue judgments about what is appropriate that should trigger the trigger warning and what isn't.
So let me ask you then: how do we create an environment that does not promote hostility toward underrepresented groups broadly defined, right? And so those underrepresented groups, by the way, could also include someone who considers themselves a fairly conservative religious minority, right? As well as people of color with a history, as well as women, as well as people with different sexual identities, right? So, so the categories of underrepresented groups could be fairly broad. How do we assure that people are getting the same educational opportunity as everybody else?
Right, so and this also feeds back to your question about equality. So that is really, I mean, that is the difficulty, because historically, just picking up on the first part of your second question, historically, free speech has often been embraced by minority groups who say, look, in a majoritarian world, the majority views that discount me will always get aired because the majority gets to say them, and our less popular views are the ones that don't get aired, and so we want really robust free speech protections because we think it's going to help us. Historically, that's why the NAACP, ACLU, et cetera, have long had this. But furthermore, historically, our answer has been, look, First Amendment says the government can't punish you, but other people can and should push back on you, can and should, frankly, ostracize you. That's not violating the First Amendment. Again, no private actor can violate the First Amendment. That's saying, I think what you did was really profoundly offensive, and I'm going to let you know that. And historically, that's been our answer, but that doesn't fully respond to your question, which is, to use a law term, what about truly discrete and insular and tiny minorities that aren't ever going to be able to bring that level of ostracism to bear? So, imagine there's a group here at Duke that has only, 6 members of it, and it is, and somebody says has speech targeted at that tiny group, whatever it might be. Are they really going to be able to effectively mobilize? I mean, maybe they'll try to get other people and build solidarity and build a coalition, maybe, or maybe there'll be so few of them that they'll never actually get anywhere. I think that's a serious problem. I mean, again, the smaller the group, the harder it is for it to be able to mobilize effectively. And this is where, in this country, our answer has been one that many people find sort of unsatisfying. Well, that's the price of free speech.
I want to come back to that in a second. Let me bring Mike in here. Just to ask you a slightly different question, which is...
I liked his question.
Okay. I'm the chooser. But yes, please answer that one as well. But let me add an additional one on the table, which is, all right, I'm an undergraduate. Let's make me an undergraduate from at Duke University, and I felt that I have been the target of hate speech. I would like you to walk me through what is the process here? How does the university think about it? What are the mechanisms for responding? How do we address students when they feel that they have been marginalized through speech? All right, but please first take the...
I can't remember if that was the second part of the first question or the first part of the second question. But
welcome to the law school, Mike.
But I think one thing that certainly we have discovered in practice, perhaps not necessarily in policy or theory, is that legislating speech on a college campus is as difficult and challenging and fraught with problems as it is anywhere else. So we have tended, and not just Duke, but I think certainly at institutions like us, we have tended to focus on the importance of the community speaking out. That there is great power, if not greater power, from the response of the community, broadly defined, around speech issues than there is of any individual. Second thing is that I just want to point out is that it's very easy to think of universities as monolithic. That is, anybody who says anything from the university is doing something on behalf of the university or speaking with the authority of everybody from the Board of Trustees on down. The messy reality is that many speech incidents on college campuses tend to come from, or the response to them tend to come from individuals acting quickly and sometimes without consultation of others, and by the time by the time that fire gets started, you are you are in the position as an institution of either defending, attacking, criticizing, undoing the actions of an individual that might not have been fully thought out. Unfortunately, we don't have the luxury of doing a deep dive analysis of every issue and incident because of the.
So just a question: How do you navigate that, right? Because I think that's so. In the first part is to say, look, there ought to be community pushback, and so I assume that may not be satisfying to the groups who feel harmed or marginalized. The second part, what you said, is it's a very thoughtful but fairly difficult as well, which is not everybody speaks for the university, and yet people perceive, whether it's a professor or a student or a staff member who says something, as this is what happened at Duke, or this is what Duke did. And then, of course, then the university has to speak officially, right? And it has this position of broad speech, or at least freedom of thought, or pluralism, and yet it has to make an official pronouncement. So, or at least it's expected to make an official.
It's pressured to make an
official. Pressured to make an. So, can you talk a little bit about the tensions, both to the first one?
And there are great tensions, even depending on who is doing the speaking. Is it a staff member? Is it a faculty member? Is it a student? Is it an alumnus? We are often, not frequently, but often held accountable for the statements that somebody who went to Duke and graduated 20 years ago might have said. So does the university then step in and address that in any content way? I think it's fair to say that we're very, very wary of making content-based, I say the university, because after all, who does speak for the university, of making...
Other than you.
Other than me, well, pretty much anybody in this room, of making those kinds of pronouncements. And we've generally taken the position, very broadly defined, that the university is not going to regulate speech, but it's also not going to withhold criticism as necessary. In other words, somebody has the ability, the right, certainly, and the opportunity to say stupid things. But that doesn't mean that they're going to be immune from criticism, attack, or the broadly defined sanction in the way of what we can do outside of a legislative space. Again, there's no good answer, and I have a very large and growing email file of messages going back 20 years about incidents that happen on campuses where I have been, that all start, and they come from all ends of all parts of the spectrum, that all start with the same phrase: I believe in free speech, but. And any incident any incident that happens on campus involving speech will trigger those kinds of messages from well-meaning, well-intentioned, in many cases very broad-minded people. But when I see the "I believe in free speech but" message, I know that there is an unanswerable request coming there. Now, to your first question, the university does even without the speech policies, and there's a task force right now that is once again grappling with these issues, that includes representation from across the university. There are a number of policies and ways in which students and others can enter the process when they have concerns about harassment, pickets, protests, demonstrations, other things. So there's one of the challenges. There's a bias response advisory committee that gets activated when there is a bias, when there is a report of a bias-related issue. There are many different ways to enter the system. I think where the friction comes sometimes is that rarely is there the ability to provide a satisfactory outcome. For all the reasons that we're talking about up here.
Let me ask one last question and then invite all of you. So this is the implanting the thought to begin to think about your questions. Otherwise, I will pick on the people who are on their cell phones. Okay, so the question is, I assume that, especially as you started, Stuart, that hate crimes are obviously easier And the question is, to what extent is that a significant problem? I mean, I guess we could start with you, Mike, on campus. How do we, we seem to think that hate speech is the one that really gives us a lot of trouble. But I also want us to think about what's the line between what is a hate speech and what is a hate crime. And do we really think that we've got the hate crimes part of it pretty much settled, that it's not something that we spend a ton of time struggling over?
I guess the hate crime would be a law enforcement.
So is that how we deal with it on campus?
Well, I mean, yes, and to the extent that it's a law enforcement issue, and a more clearly defined and clearly articulated position, that I'm not aware of. I'm not aware of situations where, or many situations where we have had to have that kind of response. I'm hedging a little bit because, again, the line between, as you've clearly articulated, the line between hate crime and hate speech if it exists at all, is a very fuzzy one.
You two, if you want to weigh in either on any of part of this conversation or on the question that I last posed.
I would just make 2 points. The first is that universities also have speech rights, right? And the university is in its discretion can exercise them. It's not under any kind of, in my view, moral or legal obligation to view whatever anyone is saying in or around campus as equally worthy. And if you hang a noose from a tree, it seems to me the university is well within its own rights to condemn it in the strongest possible terms. The other point I would make, and this goes back to the difficulty of how do you deal with this in the classroom, and people who may feel marginalized or excluded in various ways. In my experience, it's not because people make certain arguments that they find somehow unpleasant. It's because those arguments are made and there's nothing said in response, right? And so it seems, that there's no pushback, there's no interrogation, there's no, let's take this apart. So for example, right, the mismatch theory that Justice Scalia gave voice to in the Fisher affirmative action case in, the least sensitive, most offensive way, right, he could think, which is talking about lesser schools and wouldn't they all be better off? There are plenty of ways you could say that, make that same point that would not be as gratuitously hurtful. So I think if someone articulates that view and some prominent academics have embraced it, and then there's no response to it, then yeah, I could understand if I'm a person of color in that room and I believe in affirmative action, or I'm a white person in that room and I believe in affirmative action, and that was the extent of the discussion, I'd be put off. I think it's not just hurtful, it's pedagogically unsound. But if in fact you actually push back on all reasonable views that are expressed, my experience is that people don't tend to feel marginalized or victimized. Silence is much more marginalizing. The other thing I would say is I think it matters how people speak. And I try and model speaking in a professional, respectful way. And if someone says things in ways that are gratuitously hurtful, obnoxious, I'll push back on that. And is there really a need to say it that way as opposed to something else? I don't think Supreme Court justices at their worst are great models for the rest of us on how we treat one another and how we execute our responsibilities as lawyers.
I just want to say one small thing that Michael's comment made me think of. I think that the line between hate speech and hate crime is less fuzzy than I think some might want it to be. If there's a regulation that is aimed at the communicative impact of something, you can call it hate crime, you can call it a banana, but we are actually going after the communicative impact, and so this is actually an attempt at regulating your speech. And so you can try to put something in a box and say, oh, but that speech, or that banner, or whatever it might be, that crossed the line from speech into action. If the reason we're going after it is its communicative impact, then that's covered by what we think of as being the speech protections. And so this isn't an end around the speech clause to sort of try to get, we don't have sort of magic words like, oh, you've called it a hate crime now, that changes everything. It actually doesn't change anything analytically.
All right, let's open it up. be fun to pursue that line, but in the interest of bringing all of you lovely people into the conversation. Marcus. That's how they would say it in French.
First, thank you all for joining us. It's been really interesting so far. My question is about when incidences morph from becoming simply campus issues to law enforcement issues. I understand that in North Carolina we have several hate crime statutes, including one against ethnic intimidation, against hanging exhibits with the intention to intimidate. So what is the university's internal process to decide what needs to be referred to local prosecutors once one of its students has broken or potentially broken those codes?
Well, again, that's a law enforcement issue. We have a police department. They're commissioned officers. They communicate regularly with local, state, and federal law enforcement officers, as any police department would. And when there is an issue that is brought to them and that is reported, that requires further review by another law enforcement agency, then they bring it forward. Obviously, the university is not in the position to adjudicate those laws if there's, again, I'm getting into territory that's very dangerous for a non-lawyer, but the university is not in the position to enforce those laws when it's somebody else's responsibility.
I understand that students are protected by FERPA, but they're not protected if they're suspected or reasonably suspected of committing a crime that puts the safety of the campus in danger. So at what point would these students lose that protection, and the DUPD would feel comfortable with referring this to the Durham Police Department per se for further investigation?
Well, if an individual or an incident is referred to the Durham Police or to the district attorney, and then in turn to the district attorney, and that individual is charged, then he or she would be in the criminal justice system and would be outside of the FERPA coverage. But if there's no charge, then the only thing that's happening is a student conduct issue, then it is covered by FERPA. And I realize that there's a lot of disagreement about exactly what does or does not FERPA permit you to say. But the position that the university takes is to provide for the maximum privacy for all students involved, to protect the privacy for all students.
Just a very small note. Those North Carolina statutes, I mean, some of them are written broadly enough that I think, if applied, would violate. They wouldn't be able to apply because free speech would prevent their application, at least in some instances. But this is why we have courts, right? So I'm confident that some of those provisions will be interpreted narrowly to avoid First Amendment problems.
Yeah, and some of the conduct you're talking about, like threats, right, racial intimidation, that's not going to be protected.
Correct. Right.
So they're written so broadly that the courts would say it's vague, it's overbroad. But there's a core of conduct there that is prescribable consistently with the First Amendment.
Others? Yes, sir.
My question is more about the fundamental wisdom of trying to legislate this sort of thing, at least on on the governmental level. Maybe not like more on university level. I see the benefit of that. Basically, with the principle being like, do you want to have the government let the government have the power to do this, given that someone like Donald Trump might get elected?
So what role should the government have in light of
Mike, on behalf of the university.
So,
light of the Trump factor?
We're going to make Duke great again.
so let me just say, I mean, in this country, it feels natural to us that we think we've got to protect the right of the KKK to march in Skokie, Illinois, even though they chose to march in Skokie. This is a real case, because it was filled with Holocaust survivors. That's why they wanted to march there. And in this country, we think, oh yeah, of course you get the right. Of course the Nazis have the right to march in Skokie. Of course we're going to protect all these kinds of speech. And the rest of the world looks at us and says, you're crazy. This is nuts. What are you talking about? This can't possibly make any sense. I pointed to my students in First Amendment. I mean, it's kind of in the air in this country. We just think that's the way things have to be. And in other countries, they wake up in the morning and they have their espresso or croissant and they go work their 3-hour day and with a 2-hour lunch. And, they have a nice life, right? And, they cheat on their spouse, whatever it is they do, right?
You're definitely voting for Sanders, aren't you?
So, you know, what can I say? In this country, we just think Donald Trump gets to say those things. Donald Trump gets to run on a platform, the I hate everybody of X religion and Y ethnicity platform. That gets to be what I want no more people of X race in this country. And
Can I ask you all the harder question, though? Do you think it's a good idea?
so this is where I will confess to being an American. No, I'm serious. For me, it feels so.
Proud to be an American.
No, for me,
At least I know I'm free.
it feels weird to me.
You're an American.
I know, but I mean, I'm not that. It does make me feel like, okay, you know, once we do this, where do I am concerned about the slippery slope, and it might be my failure of imagination, but at least for me, I feel like, you know what, I think this actually has worked reasonably well, and so I'm wary about going down that. But
I too am an American, and I spent early part of my career in the public diplomacy world, and helping to provide information into countries many societies that did not have the kinds of freedoms that we have, and in fact, in which speech was not only heavily prescribed and limited, but was used as a weapon on its own people. And I developed a very, not that I didn't have it before, but that helped develop in me a very strong feeling of the importance of free speech, as uncomfortable as it may be, and the notion that of somebody saying you're not allowed to say that is actually quite a powerful one, and can be used to very destructive ends. So I probably end up being more of a free speech First Amendment absolutist than a regulator.
Mr. Siegel, you're an American or you're a Canadian?
Well, you know, Americans weren't Americans in this regard until what, 1930, 40, 50, right? I mean, this
you
is...
could argue 68, Brandenburg.
Right? It's, you know, it's relatively recent history, this robust First Amendment tradition. So I think we gotta say something more than just, are you with us or are you with the French, right? You know, I think I basically come down where the other folks do, which is interesting from my own point of view, because I tend to be more of an equality person than a liberty person, but I also see the ways in which liberty and equality are very much intermingled, and I don't think it's costless. I think this modern First Amendment tradition has costs. It causes real hurt and real harm, and I think we are deluding ourselves if we think it is easy or costless. But when I think about once you start going down the road of regulating speech, core political speech based on its content, based on its viewpoint, based on its capacity to hurt, how speech restrictions were used, to suppress African American thought and speech, before, during, and after the Civil War, and what the Second Reconstruction was about, and the way in which the court protected racial equality through vindicating speech values. So I worry a lot about going down that road. I should also observe, I also worry a lot about the fate of our country, and how are we going to continue, to live together, notwithstanding our profound disagreements. And if you want to know one area of constitutional law in which Justice Scalia is passing and who gets to replace him doesn't really matter much at all, right? It's this area. There is a robust bipartisan consensus on the Supreme Court outside the context of campaign finance legislation for very broad protections of freedom of speech. It's not a way in which you can ideologically slice the justices, and I worry about losing that, and I worry about how both sides of the political spectrum will start acting if they feel like this is up for regulatory grabs.
Yes.
Going back to the topic of Duke and its own policies not being regulated by the First Amendment, what is the role of the institution as teaching students that speech has consequences? We see people get fired for saying certain things. What role does the school play in that?
He's getting fired from Duke for saying certain things?
Not Duke,
Oh, okay,
but
all right, just
other
wanted.
things, you know,
I-
Facebook posts, tweet.
Yeah, I think that is an excellent point, and one that tends to get lost in the intensity of the rhetoric, that in fact this is an educational institution, that our principal mission is to teach and facilitate learning. And when that doesn't happen because there's a polarization, there are the kinds of conflicts that don't allow it to happen, I think that's a tremendous missed opportunity for the institution and an even greater missed opportunity for the individuals. So it often gets drowned out, but whenever there is an issue, an incident that takes place, there is somebody within the university who is trying to say, let's learn from this. Let's learn from this as a community. Let's learn from this for individuals and how we can model ourselves. Unfortunately, that approach does tend to get overwhelmed by the nature of back and forth that happens when it comes up. So I would encourage anybody to raise that banner when these things happen.
I also think I think professors have an opportunity in class day after day to model certain kinds of speech and not model others. I think the meta discourse can be important, particularly after certain incidents, to get together and talk about how we're going to talk about certain sensitive issues. But the day-to-day of how you come to class and how you speak to students, right, and whether or not you listen to students, and the kinds of student speech vis-a-vis other students that you encourage and discourage in terms of not what is said, but how it's said, I think that also, at least I hope, can have an impact over time.
And if I could just add one thing, don't underestimate the chaos and the pressure around any particular issue or incident when the focus, whether it's from students or faculty or activists or the news media, is not about what are you going to learn from this? It's about what are you going to do about this? And it takes, and saying we're not going to do anything about it, we're going to learn from it, gives the impression of, at the very least, it gives the impression of not caring and a lack of urgency, and that too starts to feed on itself. So it's a challenging and sometimes perilous position that every institution is in when these kinds of things come up.
Yes, Lauren.
So a little bit of what you said in terms of knowing that speech can be harmful, and I've heard from students, at least on the undergraduate campus, about not feeling safe at Duke based on the incidents that have happened just because it's not they don't feel like it's an inclusive community maybe. How do you balance knowing, not just the university, but like in the country as a whole, how do you balance this harm that can really be caused by speech and the ways that people can feel actively scared for whatever reason with knowing that we do have the freedom to say whatever we want to a point, but it's a very far point. So how, I guess, not in terms of legislation, because obviously the First Amendment has already created an opportunity for people to be able to say what they want, but in terms of recognizing that that has its own on how people are going to feel about the spaces that they're in. How do we as people, and then also how does the university, how do we make it so that that doesn't have harmful effects? Is it on like us as humans to just say like that speech? And that's kind of sounded like that's what was being said earlier, was that people can mobilize and actively speak out against things that are said that are hurtful. But is that kind of what we're reduced to at this point, is just making sure that us as people hold up this standard for human behavior to prevent people from saying things that are harmful?
Let me just take one more so we could have two on the table, and then we'll have our concluding comments. Yes.
At the university level, at least, the real question is like, what is the institutional mission of the particular university? So at Duke, maybe it's like free inquiry, free exchange of ideas, but maybe at a small evangelical Bible college, that isn't so important, and they want to indoctrinate a particular way of thinking, and free speech isn't a big deal. So So maybe the real question is like, what does a particular institution want as a kind of value, rather than a kind of general question of like, is hate speech, bad?
So two questions. One is, how do we deal with the harms of hate speech, especially if it's being visited on people who are already marginalized? And then two, how do our conceptions of speech fit with institutional mission?
So let me just jump in quickly in both of those.
And 2 minutes.
So that is, I mean, I think that is sort of one of the great questions, and this is the way in which the world has changed because of the internet. So now, any jerk, with a typewriter, I'm dating myself, with a keyboard, can just say any crazy, can say any crazy thing that's really hurtful, and the consequences of this are so broad. And I mean, this is part of the reason I was beginning with the way we're outliers in the world. In some ways, in this country, we kind of say, well, it's a free country, so if you feel bad about that, then sorry for you, and you can try to mobilize. In other countries, that's not the answer that we have, and I find that I find an unsatisfying answer here and there. I mean, I don't find either answer terribly satisfying, because the answer is there really are these harms these costs that are imposed, these harms that are visited, and we don't have a good way of dealing with it, other than the naming and shaming, other than like, can you believe with this person, and and then you can get flame war, whatever, and that's very unsatisfying. And I mean, part of the point, and our First Amendment really constrains us from being much more creative. Although, frankly, I'm not sure that again in other countries they've done it any better. Just very briefly on Matt's point, I think it's a great point. First Amendment doesn't apply. Absolutely, if I were running a college that was devoted to training the next set of people who were going to be, the leading edge of Y movement, then all I care about is that we're focused on whatever Y movement happens to be. That's all. And if you're not with the program, you're fired. Absolutely.
So, Lauren, I think your question is also the answer, in that we're all striving for a balance. On the one, while it may sound when we debate these issues a bit bloodless and a bit analytical, the fact is that every one of us is affected by the pain that individuals experience when they do not feel safe, and it's hard not to be affected in some personal way. How we balance these imperatives is, I think, one of the most difficult things that anybody, certainly my colleagues in the positions that we're in, have to deal with. So I don't have a good answer. And as for the second question, I think I will defer to my colleague on the right for his answer. So.
Mr. Siegel, you get the last word.
I mean, I don't. If we're talking about either the First Amendment itself at public institutions or First Amendment values at private institutions, it licenses racist speech, sexist speech, homophobic speech, anti-Semitic speech, speech condemning certain religions or I mean, that's what it does. And there's no way once you allow that to prevent that speech from causing harm, when what you're licensing may have the intended effect of causing harm. I don't think there's no sort of Goldilocks solution to that. You can try and have, other societies have a very different tradition. They just say certain things are out of bounds. I think there are real costs associated with that. I think there are real costs associated with this. I think it has to be, people don't feel entirely safe here at other campuses, right? There's no reason they should feel entirely safe once they leave here, wherever they're living in this country. And it has to be in ways large and small. You make people feel less alone with it, more empowered, more part of a network or a community that can push back, speak back powerfully when that kind of speech takes place. But it's not going to prevent the harm. How could it possibly do that?
So we are out of time, but we have three great Americans, though Donald Trump wouldn't recognize them as such. Please join me in thanking them for this wonderful, stimulating.